My name is David Owen. Thank you very much for having me here. The topic I'm going to speak about is basically the Qiyās in some of its different meanings between Ibn Rushd and Ibn Hazm. My primary focus is around Ibn Rushd, but I'm trying to speak to a number of issues that have already been raised here today by people who are, and yesterday by people who are genuine specialists in Ibn Rushd. So the broader frame of this work is looking at the relationship between logic and law in what we might call the continuum between Iberia and Senegal or Guinea. It has a number of common features which will be familiar to everyone in this audience. I am interested in finding lines of continuity in legal and philosophical thought from the time of what we think of as golden ages, further on into what is sometimes described as the period of sclerosis or decline. And there are a number of assumptions that come with that periodization, which I, in my conclusion, hope to destabilize a little bit, even though that's not the primary function of this contribution. So, to start with, it's important to frame the Ibn Hazm that I conceptualize in this presentation. Recent research is increasingly treating Ibn Hazm as a rationalist, not merely as a religious fundamentalist or a blind literal reading of texts in a way that fails to understand them. Ibn Hazm's literalism is quite similar to what Robert Leaf describes as the dominant Maliki literalism, the real difference being that for Ibn Hazm, linguistic rules, which will include the rules used by the faqih for interpretation, are by divine. They're by divine directive. They're not the result primarily of human convention. So one of the frames in which this new picture of Ibn Hazm not as a literalist, but as a textualist, someone who's committed to the priority of texts for directing the evolution or the establishment, the defense of the law, is to see him as a textualist. In the Anglo-Saxon world, this is associated with figures like Antonin Scalia and his students, a couple of whom sit on the U.S. Supreme Court today. So the notion of language as a closed system, which when analyzed correctly can produce a single correct solution to a problem of interpretation. Ibn Hazm very frequently will cite the qa'ida that inna al-haq fi wahid, or fi al-wahid, against other qa'ida which emphasize that say difference among jurists is a blessing. There's a thoroughgoing opposition on the textualist view to anything like instability, arbitrariness, personal subjectivity, what Ibn Hazm describes as a tahakkum, or sort of speaking in God's name on the part of the jurist. And the intention, or the attention of the jurist is always to what texts say, not to what we want to attribute to the intention of the speaker. So within a closed system, you can imagine why logical rules could play a larger role than in an open and more fluid system. And of course, Ibn Rushd's complaint, as we've heard frequently in previous presentations, is frequently that his predecessors don't establish the general rules that are supposed to guide discipline. And this is a concern that Ibn Hazm shares with Ibn Rushd. And we see it most explicitly in his treatment of the fiqh, but we also see it in his treatment of the grammarians. This is a point I'm going to come back to a little bit later. Knowledge, which is what Ibn Hazm thinks all legal rulings ought to achieve, in the Aristotelian conception, is the product of meeting 5 criteria. The most pronounced of these are that the premises need to be true, they need to be necessary, and they need to be caused by the middle term. That is to say, the conclusion needs to be caused by the middle term, because the minor and the major term need to be in a causal relationship with the middle term. If you get all of that, then you get certain knowledge. So there's some differences which are frequently elided in the secondary literature between different meanings of Qiyās and between the Qiyās and the Burhan in a logical sense of these terms. So for starters, the Qiyās fiqhi refers to both analogical and non-analogical modes of reasoning in the fiqh. Whereas the syllogism, the Qiyās Mantaqi, or the syllogismos in Greek, refers to a valid deduction, which we may or may not apply certain other rules to. But a demonstration meets certain other criteria, because a demonstration, as we just saw a moment ago, has to be from true premises. And we can have perfectly valid deductions from false premises, for instance. So consider the syllogism. All Barca fans are monarchists, all monarchists are Libyan, therefore all Barca fans are Libyan. It's a perfectly good syllogism, but it's not a demonstration because all of the premises are false. Now, the debate among the jurists, as far as I can tell, starting in a methodical way from Ibn Hazm, is whether arguments like the ruling on the iskar of the inebriating quality of wine is a syllogism, or whether these arguments need to be regimented in order to become syllogisms. And it's only if you're meeting the criteria for a syllogism that you can even begin to discuss whether these arguments reach the level of Burhan. That requires looking more closely at the textual sources themselves and the methods used to extract the premises of legal argument from the same. So, in the Taqrib, which is our earliest complete logic work from Al-Andalus, Ibn Hazm puts forward a number of arguments. I'm not going to go into them in any depth right here, but suffice it to say that Ibn Hazm wants to argue that if the law isn't burhani, if it isn't demonstrative, it's humanly made and doesn't stand for the divinely revealed law of the 2 books or the 2 sources of Islamic revelation. So he gives, for instance, a typology of arguments which has some similarities to Ibn Rushd. He refers to the Burhan, so a demonstration, the Iqna'a, which he calls simply persuasion without proof, which sounds a bit, is more pejorative than Ibn Rushd's description of Qana'a, which he says is the overwhelming consideration for something when there's an opposing consideration. And the other alternative he gives is simply shaqq, which he calls deception through an invalid proof. Now, if we compare that typology with Al-Ghazali, I think we can see how much Al-Ghazali and Ibn Hazm have in common on this point, even if Al-Ghazali is beginning to follow the developments, the contributions made to logic by Ibn Sina. So Al-Ghazali says at the beginning of the Mustasfa that if premises are certain, qat'iyya, we call this a burhan, a demonstration. If they're conceded or agreed upon, we call them musallama. And then we have qiyās jadali, as opposed to a burhan. And if they're merely probable or putative, we call them madnoon. And then this is what we call a qiyās fiqhi. In the scholarship that deals with the relationship between logic and law, I'm thinking primarily of Wa'il Halaq, but also in Ernst Eisau, and others. Al-Ghazali's taken here as presenting the mainstream view, where for the majority of the Sunni schools, the majority of Sunni jurists, the fiqh reasoning as a rule produces conjectural conclusions, tufid al-dhann. So the division by Eisau is into a formalist majority, which admit probability in some part of the law, as opposed to a materialist minority who want to insist on certainty in every detail. This materialist minority is represented in this categorization by the Zahiris and the Kufris. Now, Ibn Hazm, the perspective he brings to language is not one of prioritizing Arabic over languages. You see in his taqrib there are numerous references to Latin. We also see in Jamharat al-Ansab al-Arab, for instance, that he'll talk about the degree of language, the degree of Arabic or not Arabic, or Latini, or Ajami that different tribes in Al-Andalus will have. So he's extremely aware of the linguistic diversity around him in Al-Andalus. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any detail because time is short, but the survival of a linguistic and philosophical tradition in Al-Andalus based upon Latin precedents is something that I think needs to be explored in greater detail, and that extends even to canon law. So, moving forward to Ibn Rushd. So, within the last generation, Ibn Rushd's writing on grammar has been discovered in Boutilionit, in Mauritania, at the Sheikh Sidiya library. And we see in the early Ibn Rushd already a distrust for what the grammarians and the fuqaha describe as qiyās fiqhi. Not because, which is not to say that he thinks that jurists, grammarians can't use qiyās. What he's concerned about, it seems to me, is attributing fallible or conjectural reasoning back to God, or even, God forbid, using the qiyās as against the sema, using the qiyās to defeat an existing text, which is normally used to establish the rule. So we see here at the very end, for instance, he says, حَتَّى يَرُدُّونَ السَّمَعَ بِالْقِيَاسِ. And there are a number of other passages like this, both in his writing on Nahu and in the Daruri fi Usul al-Fiqh. Now, this is a tradition that continues onward after Ibn Rushd. We see here Maimonides in the Judeo-Arabic. If you look down on the lower right-hand paragraph, Maimonides says, وَلَنُ مَقَايِسْ أُخْرى نسميها المقاييس الفقهية ولا لا لنا لذكرها هنا. Is what he says in the Judeo-Arabic. We have other qiyāses, which we call legal, but there is no need to mention them here. So this distinction between the burhan and the qiyās mantiqi on the one hand, and the qiyās fiqhi on the other, continues on in the later tradition, perhaps against what Zaisao and Halak have argued. So we see in Ibn Juzay al-Gharnati, in the middle of the Taqrib al-Wusul, on Usul al-Fiqh, we see a chapter on the Qiyās al-Mantiqi, to distinguish it from Qiyās al-Fiqhi, and we see very clearly the criteria for burhan over against mere qiyas mantiqi, which would be just a valid deduction. And if we go on a few centuries more to Mauritania circa 1800, we see in the logical tradition itself the invocation of legal rulings within these logic handbooks that are used to teach students at the Mahdara. So if you read a logical commentary today from Mauritania, it's not unusual to see the applications of particular logical rules to the fiqh. And these will include, this is kind of the important part, these will include the taking of premises which would not have been considered demonstrative by Orthodox Aristotelians, if I can use the expression, such as mutawatirat, or premises by transmission, or premises achieved through experimental means. These are typically considered inductive and less than demonstrative in the Aristotelian tradition. What's happened in the meantime is, in order to maintain this emphasis on the possibility of burhan in legal reasoning, there's been an increasing acceptance of the mujarrabat and the mahsusat, for instance, as with the right methodological restrictions rising to the level of certainty. And that's what we see in Khadija's commentary here on the Sunnah. And I would just close by saying that this is a tradition which hasn't completely disappeared. A descendant of Khadija today, one of the commentators on the Muwafaqat al-Shatibiya, Hamdan al-Bittah, begins his treatise on Usul al-Fiqh by saying simply, Inna Usul al-Fiqh قطعية ولا ظنية وليتني تشحلنت في شيء.